I'm Cindy Kelly. It is October 27, 2017 in Washington, D.C., and I have with me Charles B. Yulish. And I'm just going to start by asking him to say his name and spell it.
Okay. Charles B. Yulish. Y as in yes, Y-U-L-I-S-H.
Great. Okay, well, Charles, you've had an amazingly interesting career, and I want you to start at the beginning, because I think your enthusiasm for all things atomic as a young man, as a boy really, is a great story. So why don't you tell us when you were born and where, and something about your school.
October 14th, 1936 in Cleveland, Ohio. And I have almost no memories of Ohio and Cleveland except that I knew I wanted to leave there, which ultimately I did, and went to Miami Beach. My parents moved to Miami Beach, and which was kind of a desolate place, really. But I swam a lot. It was wonderful in that respect. But I went to Beach High School, and I was a very naughty boy. Very naughty, and I was always getting in trouble, always playing pranks with the people. I won't even say what we did in our chemistry class. I just hope I was like every other boy of my age at the time. But then my biology teacher, who was about 5'9", and right out of a painting of what a classic woman growing up in the South would be like, was well educated and had ideas about everything. And Bertie used to tell Bertie McAllister is her name, and she would tell us in the class, now, in the midst of something, now personal hygiene is very important. Don't waste your money on any of those products like toothpaste. Baking soda is all you'll need for your toothbrush. And no underarm deodorants, just a little dab of cotton and some alcohol and you'll be just fine. And anyway, I have no idea why, but I really liked her terribly. And so I paid attention to biology and I got fascinated by it. And I would even stay after class and I would ask her questions. I said, how do you know that the xylem and the phloem are taken up and go through a venous system? I mean, how can you see it? And he said, she said, you can see some of the things on the leaf itself. I said, but how do you know what goes on inside? And so we developed a real friendship based on curiosity. And she responded to that very much, instead of kids, who just didn't care about it. And ultimately, that led to my interest in finding out what was done, and the answer to it was radioisotopes. That's how you could how they were already telling how systems worked and how they could be traced. They were called tracers in the early days. And I wrote to the Atomic Energy Commission. I got a very nice form letter back in a big, not a box, but a package of information materials. And I just found the letter recently, which was a form letter signed by George Glasheen. And he and Matty Panett, who worked in personnel, proved to be the people who started me on the track as an Atomic Energy Commission intern. But Bertie, ultimately, when I got all this stuff, I started traveling and meeting people. And I traveled to Oak Ridge, and I met Dr. Paul Aebersold. Aebersold was the head of radioisotopes for the Atomic Energy Commission. And he was a real showman. And he thrilled at what he was doing and wanted to find every way to elevate it to a high contribution. And he was extremely kind to me, extremely kind. And later that would turn out to be my salvation. But so I decided I wanted to have my own laboratory experiment to prove this. And the ingredients that were necessary were safety equipment, radiation detection equipment, radioisotopes, and the ability to handle it and store it safely. And methodically I went through each of those, and I realized that they're not going to give it to just a high school and a kid. So I decided it has to sound important. And so I sat and doodled. Finally I came up with RELPAR. RELPAR is the Radioisotopes Experimental Laboratory for Plant and Animal Research. And I had that little letterhead made. Well, it resulted in Victorine Instruments giving me several really very professional radiation detection instruments. Abbott Laboratory gave me all the assistance you could ask for. And but then I had to get the radioisotopes. And Abbott, my contact at Abbott, said, you need to get a license from the Atomic Energy Commission. We have to have that. And showed me what that's like. So I filled out the application and everything like that and sent it in. And sure enough, I get back a license for phosphorus 32. And then I thought, well, that's easy. Let's try some more. Honest, it was as simple as that. And I don't remember how many were, but they were dozens. Everything from zinc to just went on and on. And then I met Dr. Bob Bryden at Oak Ridge, who was a head of the biology section there, and he taught me how to use these things. I forget who exactly it was that taught me about radiography. And just to explain radiography, if I really wanted to know what was going on in the uptake system of a plant, you had to have the ability to put a stem of a plant or a leaf in a test tube or in a container that had the radioisotope that was appropriate. And then you're going to leave it there for a day. Then you're going to carefully take it out and put it on a large sheet of X-ray paper. And then you're going to leave the X-ray paper for 2 or 3 days, and then you're going to take it to a lab and have it developed. And it was absolutely fascinating. Bertie was thrilled. She said this is the proof she's been looking for. And it went on like that, and it seemed so normal to me. And other kids really liked the fact that, you know, they were doing something that was out of the ordinary. And then I would write up papers. I would send them to the Atomic Energy Commission. I would send them to Ralph Overman at Oak Ridge Associated Universities, and he had a slight stammer. And he says, Charles, he said, yes. He said, thank you for sending me that. And he said, very interesting that you could do that. He said, but you have to work on your grammar. That was his comment, and obviously I have always remembered that. The kids in our biology class and the other classes were saying, "What are you doing in there?" You know, and you know, I'm saying I'm having a great time, you know, but this is really interesting. And they said, you got room for us, you know? Nobody else is doing this. And so I don't know even how I did it, but I selected 4 people. And they were kind of what you might call nerds today. But they were very serious, and they wanted to do details, and they appreciated it, and they knew that there was a process involved. And that became the club, and then more kids came. And the club was not the objective, the whole objective, but that it got people interested was very important to me.
Do you remember what you called it?
Just the Atomic Energy Club, yeah. It was interesting that somebody, I have no idea who it was, but somebody kind of from one of the newspapers poked a head in and said, "What's going on here?" He said, he's heard the kids talking about it and all that. And I just explained in a matter-of-fact way what was going on and what we were doing. And I don't even know which article it is in there, but as soon as one article was printed, other newspapers became interested and wanted pictures and wanted this and wanted that. And of course that created more people who wanted to be in the club. And so then that resulted ultimately in coming to the attention of the Atomic Energy Commission. All of the publicity, and I don't know whether people wrote in concerned about this, that a high school student was doing all of this. And an inspector from the Atomic Energy Commission came to the school to see the principal and said, radioisotopes licenses show that this is where experimentation is taking place and that's where the isotopes are. And we'd like to see Dr. Yulish and really see what this is, see if the application is safe and everything. And I was called down to the office and introduced myself, and the shock on his face was very interesting to see. I just thought it was very normal. I said, "Would you like to see the lab?" And it really was like an anteroom off of the classroom, the biology laboratory. But it had, it had a sink, it had storage areas, had electricity, had all of the things that you would need for a very small workroom. And I had made radiation impeding blocks. I had built bricks of extremely dense material and used that for shielding. There was enough room for that. Anyway, he looked through things like that and he said, "How did you get these licenses?" And I said, "I applied for them and you approved them." And so he said, "I'll get back." And he must have, either he came from Washington or he reported to Washington, and it got up to Abersold. And they said, "Look, this is a minor. You cannot have a minor signing licenses and getting licenses and is unsupervised in this, except by a biology teacher in Beach High School." And Abersold thought and thought and thought, and then he remembered me. And he said, "Leave it alone. We'll get his teacher to be responsible for the licenses and everything." And he did that. And so Paul Abersold was an enabler. I always will think of him that way for the rest of my career. And the most important thing to me was that I gained my confidence in myself and was no longer a bad boy. It's amazing when you find something that so absorbs you, and it's endless. It's endless. It's not just the answer. It's one piece. And much later in life, I discovered what my motto was all those years. And it's when I worked with the Mescalero Apache Indians. And anyway, the saying, though, was Apache Munyet. Apache Munyet. And the saying really is in Russian. And it means, why not? Apache Munyet, why not? And that's what I was doing all this time. There are plenty of answers why not, but no one gave them to me. And I was extremely, extremely lucky how people responded to what was then my innocence, but my enthusiasm and willingness to do whatever was necessary. And that it worked for me with people wherever I went. I just thought, well, I got to ask Oppenheimer about some of the questions here that are just not addressed and have him clarify it. And he said, "Well, come on up and we'll talk." And then I called Groves and I said, "Is this really true?" And about so-and-so. And He said, yeah, no, whatever it was. And it just went on like that. Seaborg was taciturn, but very, very nice. And later I got to interact with him several times. It's very funny how that worked at the Atomic Energy Commission. But it's the ability, the interest to ask questions and never quite be satisfied, want to follow them all the way through, and to have a certain sense of innocence. When I went to everybody was saying at the time, a little later when I wanted to work for the AEC, they were talking about the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, which they said was the most important committee in Congress because it controlled so much money on research, development, weapons, all of that. And I got in to see the executive director. And I just started asking him questions, and that was Jim Ramey. And he just started to answer and was very interesting, and just I had a correspondence with him. So by the time I joined the Atomic Energy Commission, Ramey was a commissioner, and he'd just stop in the halls and we'd start talking, and he was shaking hands. And as an intern, everybody was looking, how does that work? Seaborg, the same thing. And they started because of Apache Muñet. So from the radioisotopes lab, I went to University of Florida and then to Kent State University, where I graduated. And I did become an intern in the, I forget what, I think 61 was the class of the Atomic Energy Commission selection of, I think it was 12 interns, and went to Washington. And so that was when I met Ramey, and we had developed into a kind of just an easy friendship, but not to achieve anything. And he liked that. I didn't want anything from him. Later on, when I had my own consulting company, that was the Atomic Energy Commission, then the Atomic Industrial Forum, where I also met an incredible amount of people. And then I had my own consulting business for many, many years. And I put on a large program called Nuclear Week in New York. And it was to be an extravaganza of showing the people all the peaceful uses of atomic energy. And the things I was able to do, and it was all Apache Muñet. I mean, I want to bring a nuclear ship into New York City Harbor. We hate nuclear, no matter what it is. But I was able to bring the Savannah, which was our beautiful, beautiful cargo ship, which was built and nuclear powered, in for that celebration. Thousands of people toured it. It was just a great thing. And so I was holding a number of briefings for audiences that I thought we should capture, and for the International Press Club and reporters and everything like that. I got the Army at Natick to irradiate foods that were part of the luncheon. They were eating radiation protected foods. And Ramey was going to be a speaker, and I said, Jim, what can you do to punch this up to get attention for what you're really going to do here? And he said, let me think of that. And so what he had in his speech was an announcement that the Atomic Energy Commission, in cooperation with the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, were going to launch an exploratory program for a water desalting plant at Bolsa Island off of Los Angeles. And he just put that together. I had great respect for Mr. Ramey. So it just amazed me, and it was a habit that I picked up, and permit me to introduce myself. That's how it always went. And I would always come up with stuff that was very off the wall, but made sense, and that I could follow through and get it done. that picture of Oppenheimer told me more than I can begin to tell you. The jumping photo. Yeah, it's just, you can have any metaphor that you want for it. But there's one of the more thoughty men that Earth has produced. And yet, what is that jump saying? And I still can't believe it, but I've had 50 years of experience in nuclear energy. I mean, starting really from the beginning, and then with using radioactive materials, getting to meet whoever it was, going all the way up through the Atomic Energy Commission. That was like getting the keys to the library, and have all the librarians were instructed to give me whatever I wanted. And went through my entire career. And I retired in 2005 and had the best 10 years before that in nuclear nonproliferation activities that I could have ever dreamed I could have done. So, life well spent, as they say.
That's good. Do you want to talk about, what do you want to talk about next? You can talk about, I'd love to hear more about the Uranium Enrichment Corporation, because a lot of people don't understand what that is and what it did, because you were there 10 years, so maybe.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I was working before that in Washington in an environmental public relations firm, and I had done a huge project for McDonald's that was totally successful, and the person who I worked with at the top management at McDonald's called and said, "I want to have a meeting with you. This is very secret." So, with a meeting. But anyway, somebody had invented a substitute for styrofoam. Styrofoam was their devil's work, and people were worried about the environment and how these things would never decay, and they were filling blah 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 blah. And they had something that was they could make a faux styrofoam, and it would be able to biologically decompose. And the company person was there and showed me a cup that was it. And the McDonald's man said, this was Shelby Yastro, and he said, "I'm not going to do anything with them unless you hire Yulish to shepherd your program going, because we trust him." And so they flew me out to Santa Barbara, and I met with Adnan Khashoggi's brother, the arms dealer's brother, who was very, very wealthy, and he had the money in the company and all that. And so they said they would make me an offer. And I got back and I said, well, this is just really exciting. This is just one of the top things you can do environmentally. And then I got a call, and would I be available for lunch to meet somebody. And I did, and it was Nick Timbers, who the government is a big thing. Congress decided that it wanted to get out of the uranium enrichment business, that it had these huge wartime production plants that would enrich uranium to 4 and 5% and sell it to the electric utilities for all the nuclear power plants that were being built. And there was just plans for 250 nuclear power plants. And so they had a study done by, I think it was Smith Barney in New York, and Timbers headed that. And when they submitted it and everything like that, they said, okay, we're going to make a federal corporation. We're going to appoint you as president for the government, and you're going to put all this together, and you're going to take over and run everything like it should be. And eventually we'll privatize, and the new board will decide if they want to keep you or not. That's just it. Well, this automatically created tremendous hostility by the people in the Department of Energy because, you know, what we've been doing this just fine, you know. Why would these business people from New York want to take over? And anyway, we had lunch and everything like that, and he said, I need to have a vice president of corporate communications. He said, I've interviewed about 30 people so far, and you sound interesting. And so I was then confronted with two offers. One, nuclear. I was just tired of nuclear at that point, but it was new. It was something completely different. And the other was environmental, and with McDonalds, I mean, you know, all of this, you know, it's like it was to be or not to be. That is the question. And I chose the nuclear because Timbers was solid, and he had a good sense of what had to be done. I knew the gaseous diffusion plants and the history of that, and I knew AEC, and I thought, you know, something good could really come from this. And so I said okay, and in February 1995, I joined. And I learned that there was something else that came along with it. And it has one of the longest names that I've ever heard. And I never have, in 20 years, I've never had it right all the way through, so I've written it down. It's the U.S., Russia, HEU to LEU purchase program. And it was that long, you know. And it was fantastic. The Russians couldn't even safeguard their weapons. The United States was paying them billions to dismantle them. And so basically what was happening was, try to imagine all of the missiles, not all, but the missiles that were aimed at Detroit, at Chicago, at Washington, at New York, at Atlanta, at Miami, all of those Russian missiles had multiple warheads, and in the multiple warheads was HEU, highly enriched uranium, 95, 98, 99%. And they were more dangerous off of the tips of the missiles and in a storeroom where guards weren't being paid. And that was viewed as the most scary of all the elements in terms of safeguards for nuclear warheads. And so a deal was cut in President Bush 1, and then was succeeded to, rather, it was taken in tow by Clinton when he was president. And anyway, it was a multi-billion-dollar deal, but it had to be implemented. It had to be implemented on a business basis. Now, just think that you could, it's not like you couldn't buy the nuclear warheads, but you could buy having the nuclear warheads blended, reverse blended down into 5% from 95%, and into a form which you could ship to us, which we could then sell to electric utilities as fuel for their nuclear power plants, which are producing electricity for the same cities. Until it became 10, 15% of America's electricity were coming from warheads that were formerly aimed at them. And it was such a beautiful symmetry. And Timbers really understood. He had come from Wall Street. He understood the importance of simple communications. And he really felt compressed work with these technical people, scientists and all that. And I gave him a one-page, and I had the full name of the deal, and I said, you can't live with this. And I said, let's just call it Megatons to Megawatts. And he said, do it. And so I was in charge of all communications having to do with the program, relationships with the Russians. We went over, I presented it, and let's see, who was Mikhailov, Viktor Mikhailov, a nasty guy who was the head of the Russian Atomic Energy Commission came, and I had a poster like that made, and he looked at it and he said, megaton to megawatt, and at the bottom I had done it in Russian. He said, megatonia megawatti, yeah, okay. So it was in every way the most exciting, one of the most exciting things. And I have to give my boss, Timbers, credit for being very conservative, which he was very, very conservative, but he could see, he could transform an idea into a vision he could see that would be beneficial to the company and that he could do. And it just gave me everything that I could ask for in terms of confidence. I was widely hated in the company for that reason, but unfortunately, here we are, and in the 10 years that I was with the company was privatized in 1998. And it seemed like every major milestone that happened to the company was forced on the company by Congress, by special interests, and led to its disaster. When the plant was going to, it was always difficult for the company or for any spokesperson, but especially for Timbers, to explain what were they created for, what were they supposed to do, and all that. And there were meetings for it, and they were going into this, that, and there was a blackboard and all that. And I just said, look, we got to have it real simple, elevator style. Government created the United States, Congress created the United States Enrichment Company. They said, take over the government's uranium enrichment business activities. It's broken. Fix it, run it like a business, and sell it, privatize it. That's the story. Everything can be told under that. And that's what they did. And it was just everything, it was like quicksand underneath the company. The further you got, the more it was harder to get your feet out of the, and stay off of it. And it basically went bankrupt, ultimately. And you could point a lot of reasons why. It's really, it's metaphorically what's happening to the entire nuclear enterprise today. The ground has just moved away from nuclear. All the things that were so important to retain, big nuclear plants, nobody wants them anymore. It's billions, it's only problems, it's opposition still, and it's cheap natural gas, no end of natural gas. And nobody could put up against the economics of that. And it really is, the shifting times, it's the story, I think, in every technology. Every technology, can it stand up against the more powerful chip, whatever is happening. But that we did it, we ultimately destroyed by recreating it, transformed it, I should say, 500 metric tons of warhead material, HEU, highly enriched uranium, into fuel successfully against attacks that were, you couldn't believe because it was a business. 20,000 warheads eliminated in producing electricity in America. Part of the deal was that the dilution took place in Russia using Russian workers that otherwise would have gone to other countries, and with their knowledge. And it's something really to be proud of. But I'll tell you something, I couldn't sell that story to the press as good as I was. And one of the reporters gave me the key insight to it, and they said, look, it's great. You've done 10,000 warheads now. He said, but that's not news. I said, why? And he said, because you're doing your job. And I said, well, what would be news? He said, if one warhead was missing, you know, then it would be an important story. And if you think about that as a metaphorical statement, a little bit of that is true in almost everything that's going on now. So Apache Muñet was very good to me there. And I retired in 2005, feeling very, very pleased and proud. And not long after that, actually, my son said, you know, I've seen all that, I've heard a lot of that stuff. And I said, Dad, are you just going to throw all that away? And I said, well, what am I going to do? You interested in it? He said, well, put it together in a notebook, you know, and so I can just have it that way. So I have two lives. I have this notebook, which is everything I've done in nuclear, and then I have another notebook, which is even larger, what I've done in environment and energy and non-nuclear things.
You mentioned the Apache several times, so why don't you talk about your work with the Apache Nation? That would be great.
Okay, this was, I think, 1991. The Atomic Energy Commission was struggling to find a way to deal with spent nuclear fuel from commercial nuclear power plants. And all kinds of ideas were put together, everything from putting it in a salt mine in Kansas all the way up to store it in a mountain and everything like that. And I told one of the, it was the director of the reactor development at the Atomic Energy Commission. I said, why are you guys screwing around, you know, with all these programs and everything? What you did is just spend some money on a big neon sign, go out to Frenchman's Flat, where you've been setting off nuclear weapons, and said, nuclear waste storage ground, open. Bzz, bzz, bzz. You know, who's going to oppose you when you've detonated over 400 weapons in that area? And what are they going to say? They're worried about contamination from spent nuclear fuel? So they had a program, and it was asking for volunteers, geographical volunteers, who would want to host a retrievable storage facility. In other words, spent nuclear fuel would be delivered. It would be in huge casks, and they would be stored on that property until the permanent waste disposal facility was available. Then they'd be transported to there. So they're not disposing of it forever. And I get a call from a guy that I had known named Miller Hudson. And Miller said, I think you'd be interested in this. And we're looking for a good public relations program for the Mescalero Apache Indians. And I said, well, who are they? And he said, well, they're right down at Alamogordo. And anyway, I flew out there, and they explained what they want to do, and I said, look, this is going to be a fight. And I said, if you like a fight, you have to play by the rules of how this has to be fought. I said, this is about gaining such respect for you that people will understand how important this is. And they had presentations from I don't know how many different firms, but they said they liked us. They liked us because, first of all, we had offices in New Jersey. And he said, New Jersey is known for its fighters. That was very funny. So I explained to them that this has to be strategy, tactics, and persona, and how people view this, and why they had to take this seriously. And so I wrote a short speech for Fred Peso and Wendell Chino, who was the president, and set up a number of venues. And he explained that they ran one of the most successful businesses called the Inn of the Mountain Gods in New Mexico. And that they knew business and that they knew what was involved. And then he would give the line. And the line would be, you don't have to tell the Mescalero Apache Tribe about atomic energy. Over my shoulder, not far from here, is where they set off the first nuclear weapon in Alamogordo, in White Sands, in the Journey of Death Mountains. So we know what we're doing, and we know what's involved here. And this is not going to be nuclear bombs. This is going to be storage of nuclear waste for all you people in the East. And that was the beginning of the relationship. Matter of fact, though, one of the funny things that happened was on one of the visits out there after it looked very, very successful, they asked me about my ring. I said it was my dad's ring, and it's the old Imperial Russian double eagle. And he said, that's what you're going to be to us now, 2 eagles. And that's what he would call me when he felt affectionate. But the program received such complicated response from the states, from everything, that they finally, it just died on itself. They never selected anybody. They never could go forward with it. That's the story of nuclear waste disposal. They could have had a neon sign and a functional place going. I think that you and I lived through an age when in a few years the threat that we all shared, it didn't care our religion, it didn't care our view on politics, it didn't care on whether we were rich, we were poor. It was, is Earth going to survive? Are we going to survive in the Second World War? With the experiences of the Depression before that, for people who came from that time. And the question is that we had to marshal our resources in order to do that. Now, I know the simple fact is that within a period of just a few years after writing a letter to Roosevelt and following up, and a committee being formed, to review it, and this and that, and basically being able to unlock the power of the universe, of the stars, of just what's locked up in atoms of uranium. I mean, you can't fathom in a realistic way that amount of energy, and that Einstein's little formula could be manifested in that way. And yet in a matter of years, just a few years, invented all of the technologies that had to be developed. We didn't care what it cost. Build every way you can possibly enrich uranium, and we'll see which one wins. It was the age of the functional government. Anything you need, anything we need in order to protect the people and win the war. And it was just an amazing time of innovation and all of that. And then today it is an age of dysfunction. A really dysfunctional government. You can't take a great idea to the government. You take it to Silicon Valley or wherever it's going to be. And so it's very difficult to put a finger on any particular problem or fault. But I can't stop myself from Apache Muñeting. My view of the demise of nuclear is you've been ruined by your obsession with bigness. You want kilowatt factories. The bigger they are, the more kilowatts, and that's the more that you can sell over a lifetime. My idea in the past few years is that the future of America depends on small modular reactors in a strategic way that would take a massive cooperation of the government and expenditure of funds. And basically, I would have, well, one aspect of it is so simple, I hope everybody can understand it. The new real estate in America are servers farms for the cloud. Farmers are alive and well and making a fortune in buildings that you never see anybody coming in or out of. There are server farms everywhere, and the reports on the business report last night was how Amazon, Microsoft, Intel are leading, and everyone's competing for their server farms. And guess what? The second thing that they're reporting in the news that the Russians are hacking into, the Koreans are hacking into, they're going for the electric transmission system. Everything depends on electricity. Everything. And what happens to the cloud when the electricity goes out, your generators go out because you don't have any more of the fuel for it, or they don't work, and you have the Fukushima equivalent of intellectual property. And so my idea is in a sense, to recreate what they did in the 1960s to build small modular reactors for the Army, which is a massive program that was anyway. And so I would want to have the government look at what are the critical spots from coast to coast in terms of infrastructure, communications, and electricity, and to take the grid and have each element of the grid available with a 200 megawatt farm, a farm of small modular reactors that are replaceable, and thus protect your long-term interests. And the same with server farms. It is important to all of us to make sure that they remain alive and well. And it's simple. You can't do it with solar, you can't do it with windmills. It's national security. That's what it really is. It's national security. And who will win a war if you don't have to kill anybody? You just have to cut off their food supply, their electricity, whatever it is. So I see that as the next possible wave, but I don't know how to achieve it, not in a dysfunction that exists today.